The strangest battle when enemies became brothers at Castle Itter, May 5, 1945. 4 a.m. Itter Castle, Austrian Alps. The silence breaks. Machine gun fire tears through the morning darkness. Tracer rounds arc over medieval stone walls like burning meteors. Inside the castle, a Wehrmacht major stands shoulder to shoulder with an American tank commander. They're defending French prisoners. Together, against their own countrymen. This shouldn't be possible. 5 days ago, Adolf Hitler ate a bullet in his Berlin bunker. The Third Reich is dying. Yet here, in a forgotten corner of Austria, the SS is launching one of the war's final assaults. Not against an enemy stronghold. Against a castle full of elderly politicians, resistance fighters, and one famous tennis player. The defenders are impossibly outnumbered. 1 American tank, 14 GIs, a handful of German soldiers who've abandoned their oaths, and prisoners who've picked up rifles for the first time in years. If the SS breaks through these walls, everyone inside dies. This is the Battle of Castle Itter, the strangest battle of World War II. And it almost never made it into the history books. Castle Itter sits on a hill above the Austrian village of Itter in the North Tyrol region. Medieval foundations, 13th century stone rebuilt in the 1800s as an alpine retreat for travelers seeking mountain air and sweeping views. By 1943, it became something else entirely. After the annexation of Austria in 1938, the Nazi government seized the castle, not for military purposes, for prisoners. Special prisoners, the kind you don't execute immediately, because they might prove useful later. The transformation happened quickly. The castle was seized by SS Lieutenant General Oswald Pohl under the orders of Heinrich Himmler on February 7, 1943. Within weeks, Itter became an extension of Dachau concentration camp, 90 miles to the northwest. But unlike Dachau, there were no gas chambers here, no mass graves. The prison was established to contain high-profile French prisoners valuable to the Reich. The residents of Castle Itter read like a who's who of French political and military power. Former Prime Ministers Édouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud, the men who'd led France into war. General Maurice Gamelin, former Commander-in-Chief of the French Army. General Maxime Weygand, another military commander who'd witnessed France's collapse in 1940. Trade union leader Léon Jouhaux, tennis champion Jean Borotra, even Charles de Gaulle's older sister, Marie-Agnès Caillot. These weren't ordinary prisoners of war. They were hostages, bargaining chips, insurance policies against an uncertain future. The conditions weren't brutal by concentration camp standards. The prisoners occupied cells converted from hotel guest rooms and had a service staff from Dachau. They had adequate food and were free to walk within their compound. But freedom ended at the castle walls. Beyond those walls, the SS controlled everything. For 2 years, they waited, watched the war unfold through rumors and whispered news, wondered if they'd survive to see liberation. By April 1945, that survival was anything but certain. April 30th, 1945. Berlin. In a bunker 50 feet beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden, Adolf Hitler places a Walther pistol to his temple and pulls the trigger. His body is carried up concrete stairs, doused in petrol, and set ablaze as Soviet artillery pounds the city above. The news spreads like wildfire through what remains of Nazi Germany. Some units surrender immediately, others fight with desperate, fanatical fury, and some simply disappear. At Castle Itter, the mood shifts from tense to terrifying. Toward the end of April, a constant stream of senior SS officers arrived at the castle, often accompanied by their wives and always loaded down with weapons, baggage, and booty. The SS men used Itter as a way station as they attempted to escape the advancing Allies. On the night of April 30th, the same night Hitler died, Eduard Weiter, the last commander of Dachau, settled in with a retinue of his subordinates and their wives and children, Weiter had ordered the execution of some 2,000 prisoners before leaving Dachau. The French prisoners knew what this meant. Weiter didn't flee Dachau to protect VIPs. He fled to escape justice. His presence at Itter was a death sentence waiting to happen. But then, something unexpected. On May 2nd, Dachau's commandant fled to Castle Itter as the camp was being liberated by US troops, but he committed suicide. Weiter put a bullet in his own head rather than face what was coming. 2 days later, on May 4th, the remaining SS guards simply vanished. The castle's own commandant and camp guards abandoned their posts, leaving the prisoners in charge but unable to leave because hostile Germans remained nearby. The French prisoners were suddenly free and completely trapped. SS units still controlled the surrounding area. The nearby town of Wörgl, just 5 miles down the mountain, was crawling with Waffen-SS troops. The roads were still full of patrolling SS troops setting up roadblocks and machine gun posts. If the prisoners tried to walk out, they'd be shot on sight. Worse, rumors circulated that elements of the 17th Waffen-SS Panzergrenadier Division had been ordered to descend on the nearby castle and execute all prisoners who remained there. They had hours, maybe less. The French huddled in the castle's great hall and made a desperate decision. They would send for help. 2 messengers, 2 directions. Pray one gets through. First messenger, Zvonimir Chuchkovich, an imprisoned Yugoslav communist resistance member from Croatia who worked as a handyman at the prison. On May 3rd, Chuchkovich left the castle under the pretext of performing an errand for the prison's commander, Sebastian Wimmer. He didn't head for nearby Wörgl, too dangerous. German troops everywhere. Instead, Chuchkovich pressed on up the Inn River valley towards Innsbruck, 40 miles distant. Late that evening, he reached the outskirts of the city and encountered an advance party of the American 103rd Infantry Division and informed them of the castle's prisoners. At dawn, the Americans mounted a rescue, heavily armored, ready for anything, but they were stopped by heavy shelling just past Jenbach, around halfway to Itter, then recalled by superiors for encroaching into territory of another US unit bureaucracy and artillery. The rescue died before it began. Back at the castle, the prisoners didn't know Chuchkovich's fate, so they sent a second messenger, Andreas Krobot, the Czech cook, armed with nothing but a bicycle and a handwritten note. Krobot pedaled down the mountain road on the morning of May 4th past German positions. SS patrols made it to Wörgl, 8 kilometers away, expecting to find Americans. He found Germans instead, but not the Germans he feared. Major Joseph Sepp Gangl was everything the Nazi propaganda machine celebrated. Born September 12, 1910, Gangl was a career soldier in the Wehrmacht since 1935. He'd fought in Poland, France, and Russia. From the war's beginning to Stalingrad, Normandy, and Bastogne, Gangl had seen everything. He'd been wounded multiple times, decorated for bravery, promoted through the ranks. By May 1945, Major Gangl commanded what remained of an artillery unit near Wörgl. But he no longer believed in the cause. A few days after arriving in Wörgl, Gangl contacted the local group of Austrian resistance under Alois Meyer. He provided the resistance fighters with information and weapons. He'd made a choice. When ordered to retreat and regroup with SS forces, Gangl defied orders to retreat and instead threw in with the local resistance. His mission became simple: protect the civilians of Wörgl from SS reprisals. According to an order from Heinrich Himmler, all male residents of homes displaying white flags were to be shot. Gangl saw it as his obligation to stay in place to protect the residents from reprisals with his soldiers. He had about 10 men, former artillerymen like him, all waiting for the Americans to arrive so they could surrender with dignity. Then Andreas Krobot, the Czech cook, came cycling into town, Gangl listened to Crobot's story. French VIPs trapped in a castle, SS units preparing to attack. Time running out. Gangl had intended to assault the castle himself, but had been unwilling because of the few soldiers in his ranks, choosing to secure the village instead. He had hoped American troops would deal with the castle. Now Gangl had no choice but to go to them. He climbed into a Kubelwagen, a German military vehicle, with Crobot. They drove north to Kufstein, about 8 kilometers away. And Gangl did something extraordinary. He approached American lines under a white flag, Lieutenant John C. Jack. Lee Jr. sat cross-legged on top of his Sherman tank on the morning of May 4th, 1945. A stocky 27-year-old from Norwich, New York, Lee had led Company B of the 23rd Tank Battalion on a headlong advance across France, into Germany, and now into Austria, in what would turn out to be the last days of World War II in Europe. His tank, an M4A3 Sherman, bore the name Besotten Jenny, painted on its hull, a nickname given by one of his African-American soldiers after a cheating girlfriend. Lee's crew loved that tank. They'd fought their way through France together, survived artillery barrages and ambushes, earned medals and scars. Now they were waiting. In the town square of Kufstein, waiting for the 12th to be relieved by the 36th Infantry Division, the war was over. Everyone knew it. Germany would surrender any day now. Lee was thinking about going home, about peace, about never seeing another German soldier again. Then a Kubelwagen rolled into the square, white flag fluttering, and out stepped a Wehrmacht major in full uniform. This was Major Josef Gangl. Still wearing his uniform, got out with his hands in the air. He was led to the nearest U.S. officer, Captain John Carey Lee. Through a combination of broken English, German, and hand gestures, Gangl explained the situation. French VIPs. Castle Itter. SS attack imminent. Lee didn't hesitate. In defiance of orders, he immediately volunteered and got approval from headquarters to help with the rescue. Within an hour, Lee assembled a rescue force. He requisitioned 5 more tanks and supporting infantry from the recently arrived 142nd Infantry Regiment of the 36th Division. This would be a proper rescue operation, armor and infantry, overwhelming force. But as they approached a bridge leading toward Itter, disaster struck. Lee was forced to send the reinforcements back when a bridge proved too flimsy for the entire group to cross once, let alone twice. Lee made a decision, leaving one of his tanks behind to guard the bridge. He set back off accompanied only by 14 American soldiers, Gangl, a driver, and a truck carrying 10 former German artillerymen, 1 Sherman tank. 14 GIs, 10 Germans, against whatever the SS could throw at them. As they rolled toward Itter, they encountered an SS unit setting up a roadblock 6 kilometers from the castle. They defeated a party of SS troops that had been attempting to set up a roadblock. The brief firefight scattered the SS soldiers. Lee's convoy kept moving. They arrived at Castle Itter as darkness began to fall. The French prisoners greeted them warmly, but were disappointed with its small size. Picture this scene: a medieval Austrian castle. Inside, French politicians who'd spent 2 years in captivity now hold rifles again. An American tank commander assessing defensive positions, a German Wehrmacht major organizing his former artillerymen, and walking among them all, an SS officer. Kurt Siegfried Schrader was an SS officer whom the French prisoners had befriended during his convalescence from wounds and who was living locally. The prisoners asked him to take charge of their defense. Schrader had become disillusioned with the Nazi regime, like Gangl. When the French asked for help, he brought his family to the castle for protection and joined the defense. Lee surveyed the situation with a tactical eye. Lee placed the men under his command in defensive positions around the castle and positioned his Sherman tank, Besotten Jenny, at the main entrance. The castle's medieval walls provided some advantage. High ground, stone fortifications, clear fields of fire. But Lee's force was pitifully small. They didn't have enough vehicles to move all the soldiers and the prisoners, so they would have to hold out until help arrived. Before the main assault began, Gangl was able to phone Alois Meyer, the Austrian resistance leader in Würgel, and ask for reinforcements. Only 2 more German soldiers under his command and a teenage Austrian resistance member, Hans Waltel, could be spared, and they quickly drove to the castle. As night fell on May 4th, the defenders prepared for what was coming. American GIs checked ammunition. Wehrmacht soldiers manned positions alongside them. French generals and politicians who hadn't fired a weapon in years cleaned rifles. Lee had ordered the French prisoners to hide, but they remained outside. They refused to cower, while others fought for their lives. In the darkness beyond the walls, SS reconnaissance elements began probing the castle's defenses. Throughout the night, the defenders were harried by a reconnaissance force sent to assess their strength and probe the fortress for weaknesses. Sporadic gunfire, shadows moving in the tree line, the psychological warfare of an enemy testing your resolve. Inside the castle, in the Great Hall, an extraordinary moment unfolded. An American Army captain, a Waffen-SS officer, and a German Army major made a plan to defend French hostages from loyal Nazis in a medieval Austrian castle. Enemies planning together, allies by necessity, united by a single imperative: survive until dawn and hope reinforcements arrive. May 5th, 1945. 4 a.m. The main assault began. A force of 100 to 150 Waffen-SS soldiers, led by Oberführer Georg Bockmann, who had been occupying some hills near the town, decided to attack the castle. Machine gun fire and anti-aircraft shells hit the castle to such an extent that some bricks began to collapse, one hitting and injuring Schroeder's wife. The defenders returned fire from the walls. Black American soldiers and soldiers that had sworn loyalty to Hitler stood shoulder to shoulder, firing away. The tank, Besotten Jenny, roared from the main gate, providing machine gun fire support as Corporal Edward Schimczyk hammered away with the main gun. The French fought with desperate courage. Former French Army Chief of Staff Weygand helped Lehmann a .30 caliber machine gun they had mounted on the walls, but the SS had numbers, and worse, they had an 88mm anti-tank gun. The 88mm flak gun was one of Germany's most feared weapons. Originally designed as anti-aircraft artillery, it proved devastatingly effective against tanks. The SS positioned it with clear line of sight to the castle gate, and they aimed it at Besotten Jenny. The Sherman tank provided machine gun fire support until it was destroyed by German fire from an 88mm gun. It was occupied at the time only by a radio man seeking to repair the tank's faulty radio, who escaped without injury. The explosion rocked the castle. Besotten Jenny, the tank that had carried them through France and Germany, the tank named for a cheating girlfriend, exploded in a burst of flame and metal. The radio man scrambled out, miraculously unharmed. But with the tank destroyed, the SS pressed their advantage. Several Wehrmacht and American soldiers were also killed from the still-firing 88mm gun and a well-concealed sniper. The defenders were being picked off. Ammunition running low. No tank, no radio contact with reinforcements. Lee began pulling men back. The next move was literally medieval. Withdrawal into the castle's massive keep. There they would use their last remaining bullets to defend every stairwell, hallway, or floor. This was the Alamo. Make them pay for every inch. And then, Major Joseph Gangl saw something that made his blood run cold. Former French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud had moved to a position near a window, exposed, vulnerable. Gangl was fatally hit by a sniper while trying to get former French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud out of the line of fire. The bullet struck Gangl in the chest, a 7.92mm Mauser round, fired by an SS sniper who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. the German major who'd defected, who'd risked everything to protect civilians and prisoners, who'd driven under a white flag to find Americans he'd fought against for years, dropped to the stone floor. He died protecting a French politician, the man who'd been Germany's prime minister when France and Germany went to war in 1939. The same war Gangl had fought in from the beginning. The irony was almost poetic. Gangl was honored as a hero of the Austrian resistance. A street in Wörgl was named after him. But in that moment, on the cold stone floor of Castle Itter, Joseph Gangl's death meant something more immediate. It meant the defenders were dying. It meant time was running out. The SS sensed victory. They surged forward, moving toward the gatehouse where, besotted Jenny's burning hulk still smoldered, Lee prepared for the final stand. Every remaining defender fell back to the keep. This was it. Back in Wörgl, Jean Borotra, the French tennis champion, had made an impossible decision hours earlier. Tennis star Jean Borotra offered to vault the wall and run through a labyrinth of enemy soldiers, which Lee accepted. Borotra managed to get through unscathed. The 46-year-old former champion had scaled the castle wall in darkness, dropped to the ground outside, and sprinted through SS positions. He found elements of the 142nd Infantry Regiment and asked them to repair to the castle with all possible speed. The defenders, Borotka told them, were severely outnumbered, outgunned, and low on ammunition. Now, at 4 p.m. on May 5th, that relief force arrived. Sherman tanks from the 142nd Infantry Regiment crashed through the SS positions. Machine guns opened up the exhausted SS troops who'd been fighting for hours, suddenly faced fresh American armor and infantry. The relief force defeated the SS, taking close to 100 prisoners. The battle was over. Inside the castle, the defenders, American, German, French, Austrian, collapsed against the walls. Gangl was the sole defender to die during the battle. Though 4 others were wounded, every single French prisoner survived. In the courtyard, amid the smoke and spent shell casings, American soldiers shook hands with Wehrmacht troops. SS prisoners were marched away under guard. The French emerged from the keep, blinking in the afternoon light, hardly believing they'd lived Borotka. Despite having been told to stay out of the fighting, simply borrowed a uniform and rifle and went with the relief force. The tennis champion had fought twice in one day. 2 days later, on May 7th, 1945, Germany signed an unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. For Lee and his men, the battle's aftermath was more anticlimactic. The 7 Americans and the surviving Wehrmacht soldiers all piled unceremoniously into the back of a 2.5-ton truck for the ride back to Kufstein. Once there, the Germans were marched off to a POW cage. For his service defending the castle, Lee was promoted to captain and received the Distinguished Service Cross. He died in 1973. Kurt Siegfried Schrader received a 2-year sentence after he was arrested and charged by U.S. forces for his former affiliation with the Nazi Party. His sentence was shortened in respect to his efforts at Itter. The French prisoners returned to France. Édouard Daladier, Prime Minister at the outbreak of World War II, and Paul Reynaud, who succeeded him, were key figures whose experiences and perspectives would heavily influence France's post-war policies and its approach to European integration. If the SS had managed to get into the castle and kill all these French VIPs, the history of post-war France would have been radically different. These prisoners formulated the policies that carried France into the 21st century. The Battle of Castle Itter faded from public memory for decades, a footnote in history books, a strange anecdote overshadowed by D-Day and Stalingrad and Hiroshima. But its significance endures. It is thought to be the only time that Americans and Germans fought as allies during World War II. Return to that morning, May 5th, 1945. 4 a.m. machine gun fire in the darkness, American and German soldiers fighting together. French prisoners refusing to hide an SS sniper's bullet taking the life of a German hero who'd chosen conscience over obedience. History loves clean narratives. Good versus evil, allies versus Axis. But Castle Itter refuses that simplicity. Here, the lines blurred. A Wehrmacht major became an Austrian resistance hero. An SS officer fought against his own organization. American soldiers trusted their former enemies enough to fight beside them. And French prisoners, men who'd spent years locked in cells by German guards, stood on walls and fired rifles to help defend those same Germans. The battle lasted less than 12 hours. Only one defender died. The tactical significance was minimal. The war would have ended 2 days later, regardless. But something happened inside those medieval walls that matters beyond tactics and strategy. For a few desperate hours, when survival demanded it, old enemies saw each other as something else. As men, as soldiers, as human beings worth saving, even at the cost of your own life. Major Joseph Gangl made a choice. He could have retreated with his unit, could have surrendered to Americans and sat out the war's final days as a comfortable POW, could have simply disappeared into the chaos of a collapsing Reich. Instead, he drove under a white flag to find Americans, stood with them against his own countrymen, and died protecting a French politician who'd once been his enemy. Captain Jack Lee made a choice. He could have waited for orders, could have left the rescue to another unit, could have thought about his own survival in a war that was essentially over. Instead, he took 14 men and 1 tank into hostile territory to save prisoners he'd never met. The French prisoners made a choice. They could have hidden in the keep, could have let the soldiers do the fighting. Instead, they picked up rifles and stood on the walls. These choices matter. In the spring of 1945, as the Nazi regime collapsed into blood and ash, a handful of men demonstrated something the war had tried to beat out of everyone: the capacity to see beyond uniforms and nationalities to the shared humanity underneath today. Castle Itter stands above the village of Itter, privately owned, closed to the public. There's no grand monument, no museum, just an old castle on a hill where, for one impossible night, enemies became brothers, and where a German major named Joseph Gangl proved that courage doesn't always mean fighting for your country. Sometimes it means fighting against it. Sometimes it means standing between a French prime minister and a sniper's bullet. Sometimes it means doing what's right, even when everything you've been told says it's wrong. Popular accounts have called it the strangest battle of World War II. Strange, yes, but also, perhaps, the most human.